Hey guys, Lucas Cursor here at Method Ministries, and welcome back to another episode. And today I'm going to talk about John Wesley's eschatology. And I want to make this video because one, it's a really interesting study learning what John Wesley believes about eschatology. And I say that not because he's just your typical, millennial category of whether he's a post-mill or a pre-mill, but he has a different millennial view than any other person that I heard of. In fact, there were other people who believed it, and I'll even talk about where he got his unique millennial view. But it was fun studying that and just understanding how he viewed the end times, and in specifically Revelation chapter 20, because I wanted to find out, was John Wesley a post-millennialist or was he a premillennialist? So that's what I wanted to find out, because some people say he was a pre-mill, some people say he was a post-mill. But in fact, what I learned was that he is neither. So stick around and find out, what is John Wesley's eschatology view, and is John Wesley a pre-mill or a post-mill? Okay, so before I start this video, there's two books that I recommend that if you want to do a further study and just understand this a little bit more. And this is where what helped me learn better is what John Wesley believed on this. And the first one is Joy of Heaven to Earth. If you can see it, Joy of Heaven to Earth Come Down. That was by Robert B. Brown. And I think this might have been actually a dissertation made into a book. You can find it on Amazon. It is, I think it's not the cheapest of what I remember. I mean, it's not too expensive, but for what it was a little more on the pricey side. And I think that's because it wasn't so popular. So maybe he just jacked the price up a little bit. And it seemed like, if memory serves me correctly, it was a dissertation paper. And the second book I recommend is The Second Coming. This is a Wesleyan approach to the doctrine of last things by H. Ray Dunning. You can see I still got my bookmark there because I'm still working. Oops, just lost my page. I'm still working through this book, but it does talk about John Wesley's eschatology view and if he was a pre-mill or a post-mill. So let's answer the question. So which one was John Wesley? Well, the answer is, if you go by his study notes, he was neither. John Wesley was neither a post-mill or a pre-mill. Instead, John Wesley was a dual millennialist. Have you ever heard that term? Dual millennialism. So it means exactly what the title says. John Wesley held that there were two millennial reigns or two millennial periods in Revelation 20. And it's important to understand this because I see both people in both camps, or maybe even not in a Pacific millennial camp, but they usually associate John Wesley with this eschatology group or that eschatology group. And sometimes that can be because we're zealous for our eschatology. We want the people or our heroes of the faith, or even other people in history, famous men of God, to be vouching for our camp, and then we use them to bolster bolster our credentials and validate our eschatology systems. But now that I know the truth, I don't appreciate, or I don't like, I should say, I don't want to use too harsh a word, but I don't like when I see people saying John Wesley was a pre-mill. I don't like when I see people saying John Wesley was a post-mill. I kind of cringe now because I know it's actually just not the case at all. And all you have to do is just read John Wesley's study notes. They're free. You can access them online. So you don't have to pay a penny, and you can just go to Revelation chapter 20 and just read how he interprets that, what he believes about Revelation 20, what he believes about the millennial kingdom. That's all you have to do. It's really easy. And if you do, you will find that John Wesley held that there were two millennial periods. So if you're like me, you might, the first time hearing this, it might sound very foreign to you. Like, what in the world is John Wesley talking about? Where does he get two millennial periods, for crying out loud? But he does have his reasons for it. And it even challenged me to figure out, okay, well, am I not seeing that? Like, is that the case? When I hear views, I want to test it by the scripture and see if it holds up, and try to test its consistencies. So I wanted to try, and that required me first to understand, well, why does John Wesley believe this? What is he arguing? And he does have arguments, and I'll go over those shortly. But to give you the background to this, so John Wesley was influenced by Johann Bengal. So he was influenced and relied heavily on Johann Bengal. If you don't know who he is, I learned all about him from John Wesley, and he actually mentions this in his notes and in the book of Revelation. So John Wesley notes that Johann Bengal not only influenced him, but he thought that he had a wonderful commentary on understanding what Revelation is talking about. And so he got this view of two millennial periods from Johann Bengal. Johann Bengal was not a Methodist, he wasn't a Wesleyan. He was actually a Lutheran theologian, and he wrote a commentary on the New Testament, which obviously includes the book of Revelation. And by the way, I actually been using his commentary, that is Johann Bengal's, a lot, not just on in Revelation, but even throughout the entire New Testament. And it's really really good, and it's actually one of my favorite commentaries right now. So I'm trying to get away from modern commentaries and just see how people in the 17th 18th century understood theology in the Bible. And I find out, or I'm finding out that it's very, much more richer than contemporary commentaries. I feel like they had a better understanding of theology back then, and they were just deeper, and it kind of helps to, I guess get me out of my modern evangelical background bubble that I grew up in with theology, and especially eschatology. So if you're listening, I recommend actually you go online. You could do the same thing with John Wesley notes. You go online and you can find Johann Bengal's commentary notes. They're free. So just like John Wesley notes are free, so is Johann Bengal's. You just got to type in and Google Johann Bengal commentary on the Bible, and it will pop up, and you can see what Johann believed about this verse, but in particular with this video, Revelation 20. So Johann Bengal is the man that influenced, inspired, and what John Wesley went to for understanding the book of Revelation. And they argue that there's two millennial periods. Now, I do need to mention, though, okay, that John Wesley, like Johann Bengal, and like pretty much everybody in that time frame, that the 17th century, probably even earlier too, but I think even going to the 18th century, but in that 17th century, pretty much every Christian held to an historic view of the book of Revelation, or an historicist approach to the book of Revelation. So like now, many modern Christians today, Christians living in the 21st century, and late 20th century, they are, when it comes to the book of Revelation, they're futurists. So they believe and understand the book of Revelation to be talking about future events. So historicism understands the book of Revelation as prophecy gradually unfolding throughout time. So that's what you need to know about historicism. Historicism sees the events in the book of Revelation as gradually unfolding throughout time, accumulating in the return of Jesus Christ. So that's why, if you view their commentaries, they have, when you go to like Revelation 9 or 10 or 11, they say, okay, 9 was about this period of time, 10 was about this period of time, 11 was about this period of time. So it's unfolding throughout history. And there actually is a case to be made for this. I don't hold to historicism. I hold to, some parts of the Bible I do believe are to be understood, through an historic lens. That is, again, they're about events gradually unfolding rather than just events one moment in time. So think of Daniel's 70th week. If you know what I'm talking about, if you really know your eschatology, Daniel's 70th week is a prophecy of about 490 years. Now, whether you believe that the 70th week is fulfilled or is going to be fulfilled, if you just look at that prophecy as a whole, it's telling Daniel there are 70 weeks determined here, and 70 week scholars will tell you are 490 years, because each week is 7 years. So 7 times 70 is 490. But you have 490 years. So rather than a prophetic one-time event in history, it's about a prophecy that will gradually unfold in history. And speaking of the book of Daniel, and if you also go and remember in Daniel, test my memory right now, Daniel chapter 7, where he sees, Daniel chapter 2 through 4, he sees the vision of the statue, of the great statue, and this part of the statue, that part of the statue is representing kingdoms in the world that exist. And it goes through like Greece all the way to Rome. Starts with and includes Greece, Rome, Babylon. So that statue is representing kingdoms not in one moment of time, but gradually unfolding in time. So you had the period of the kingdom of Greece, the period of the kingdom of Rome, and again, this is prophecy, but not one moment in time, but gradually unfolding in time. And so they understand the entire book of Revelation like this, starting from chapters 1 all the way to 22. So that's the backdrop to John Wesley's view, as well as Johann Bengal, and as well as pretty much every theologian that you could come across. And one significant feature of historicism, okay, and probably the most popular aspect of it, is that they believe the Antichrist in Revelation 13 is the papal system. So they believe that the Antichrist is the Roman religion, and the Pope is the Antichrist. So, not just one Pope, because there were many popes, but the Pope is the Antichrist, or the papal system. Papal system. I may be saying that wrong. The papal system, they're the Antichrist. So they interpret the Catholic religion to be the religion of the Antichrist, and they interpret the first beast in Revelation 13 to be the Pope, or the current reigning Pope, and then the second beast is the political aspect of the Catholic religion. Think the Vatican. There's a Vatican City. There's politics involved. So that's the famous part, the famous feature, and probably one of the most significant aspects of historicism, that they believe Revelation 13 is speaking about the Catholic Church. And they'll argue from the point of the Reformation, when during that time period the Catholic Church was heavily persecuting Christianity, and doing horrible things to Christians. And you can kind of just understand how they viewed it once you look back and see how much the Roman Catholic Church persecuted Christianity, and just look at like the whole Reformation and Martin Luther and the whole battle. So historicism understands Revelation 13 to be talking about and fulfilled in the Roman Catholic Church and the current reigning Pope. So rather than Revelation 13 being one moment in time, it's trans-historical, in that it doesn't just refer to one period of time, but it transcends time in the sense of it goes from this century to this century. So it's beyond just the 42 months as Revelation 13 talks about. I figured somebody who watches the video is going to be very interested in eschatology. So if I'm not defining my terms and kind of just spitting out facts too fast, I'm kind of assuming that the person who's clicking on this video just already kind of knows this. If not, just go do a further study or drop a comment. But anyway, so let's go back to the topic. So John Wesley, like Johann Bengal, like everybody, held an historic view of Revelation. So this is why when you get to Revelation 20, they don't believe Revelation 20 or understand it in terms of like a current post-millennialist or an amillennialist, where that 1,000 years is covering the entire period of the church history. They believe it's a future event. Now, John Wesley, let me just say this too. John Wesley did not believe that Revelation 19 was the second coming of Christ. That's the first thing I want you to know. John Wesley did not believe that Revelation 19 was the second coming of Christ. He believed, just like most classical postmillennialists of the time, or Puritan postmillennialists, that was referring to a future time when Christ would defeat the Roman Catholic religion and put down even the Muslim religion. Then Revelation 19 would follow that chronologically. So this would be a prophecy unfolding gradually throughout time. So now when you get to Revelation 20, John Wesley believed that verses 1 through 3 was one period of time, and verses 4 through 6 was another period of time. All right, guys, so let's look at Revelation 20 and let's see how John Wesley understands and how he would argue for two millennial periods. So the first thing that John Wesley would point out is that he would say that each millennial period is distinguished from each other. So we have two millennial periods. So we have Satan's millennial period, and then we have the saints' millennial period. Now, John Wesley doesn't specifically argue like that, but I'm just doing that, to help you understand what John Wesley believed on that. So verses 1 through 3 are their own section of scripture, and verses 4 through 6 are their own section of scripture in reference to the timing. So we have the first millennial period, which is Satan's binding, and then we have the second millennial period, which is the saints reigning with Christ. 2 millennial periods. And John Wesley would point out that each section, each millennial, starts out without the definite article. So take, for example, verse 2. It says that Satan is bound for 1,000 years. Notice it doesn't say the 1,000 years, it's 1,000 years. So it's a period of time. It does the same in verse 5. It says the rest of the dead, in verse 4, it says the saints that came to life and reigned with Christ, not for the 1,000 years, but 1,000 years. So a period of time. And then the next time it mentions that respected millennial period, it does in fact use the definite article. So take verse 5 of Revelation 20. It says the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. So until the 1,000 years were completed. And it uses the definite article to show that it's speaking to that specific time period. So the 1,000 years is showing you, hey, I'm speaking to this millennial period. It does the same in verse 3. It says, and then after Satan is bound, it says, he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him. So he would deceive the nations, any longer. Would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. So John used the definite article to show that he's referring to that specific millennial period. So each millennial period starts out without the definite article, and then in the next sentence that would mention 1,000 years, it would use the 1,000 years to show it's referring to that 1,000 years, that period of time. So, for us, we wouldn't really think much of that. I never, saw it that way at all. John Wesley grabbing from Johann Bengal, which if you haven't noticed, or, if it's not clear, Johann Bengal is John Wesley on Revelation 20. John Wesley is Johann Bengal on Revelation 20. If you read Johann Bengal's notes, it's pretty much verbatim, because John Wesley, again, just pretty much, a lack of a better word, John Wesley just plagiarized Johann Bengal on Revelation 20. So, he just pretty much took everything that he said and just taught it exactly like that. So they're pretty much identical. So talk about Wesley is to talk about Bengal when it comes down to the dual millennial view. So that's how they would argue that. They would also argue secondary is that the first millennial period terminates at the release of Satan, and the second millennial period terminates at the general resurrection of the dead. So you can see the differences between the two, where Satan's millennial period ends when he's released. The saints' millennial period ends at the general resurrection. It says in verse 5, the rest of the dead did not come to life until 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. So these two are both a period of time, and they both end with distinct features of that period of time. And John Wesley would then further argue that there's a benefit to this interpretation. He would say that you could affirm both views of the Postmil vision, though he didn't use the Postmil vision. I'm using that because we understand millennialism in those terms. So John Wesley would argue that there's a benefit, so you could understand the prophecies referring to the flourishing of the church and the spreading of the gospel as being fulfilled between verses 1 through 3, because Satan is not on the earth. He's not deceiving the nations any longer. So the church has unfederated access to go preach the gospel and have free range of God's scripture spreading throughout the land, souls being saved. So that's fulfilling the flourishing of the church. And then verses 4 through 6 are fulfilling the aspects where the days prior to Jesus' return are going to be filled with depravity. Well, why is that period going to be filled with depravity? Aren't the saints reigning with Christ? Well, they are, but they're not reigning with Christ on the earth, but in heaven. So John Wesley would then have a amillennial view of the saints' millennial. So the coming to life, John Wesley wouldn't see that as a physical resurrection, but of reigning with Christ in heaven. So all the saints would be with Christ in heaven. And then that would that would have an amillennial interpretation of Revelation 20 verse 4. And then that would fulfill the last days being full of depravity. Like John Wesley actually quotes Luke 18, where it says that when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? John, Jesus is saying that, hey, when, he's using a rhetorical question to say, hey, when I come back, the earth is going to be faithless. Or, think of what Jesus says, when he comes back or prior to the last days, it will be like the days of Noah. Well, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because the saints aren't on the earth; they're in heaven. So again, John Wesley would say, see that there's a benefit to holding two millennial periods. You can say the church will flourish. If you want to say the post-mill vision, it's the same thing. That will be fulfilled. The post-mill vision will be fulfilled, and also the pre-mill view of the last days being full of apostasy and degeneracy would be fulfilled. So you would have both aspects. Really, I would even argue, if you put it all on the table, you're going to have a blend of all three millennial periods into this view of dual millennialism, because you have the last day eschatology of premillennialism being fulfilled, as well as the post-mill flourishing being fulfilled, and then the amillennial interpretation of verse 4 being fulfilled, where the saints are reigning with Christ in heaven, not on the earth. So that's John Wesley's dual millennialism. Now, where the second coming of Christ comes into this, John Wesley isn't clear. You can read his notes. He's not clear when Christ comes, though they both believe that Christ would come after these millennial periods. So in that sense, he's a post-millennialist, not in our understanding of post-millennialism, but in the sense of Christ is coming after the millennial period. So post means after. So Jesus would come after these two millennial periods. So that's John Wesley's understanding of these two. And I'll read a study notes for us too, just to help flesh this out a little bit more. All right, so let me pull up John Wesley's study notes for us. That way we can read a little bit more and try to flesh out how he argues and why he believes in two millennial period. And this is just a website that you can find online, is studylight.org. So the website, just Google John Wesley notes, and there is a couple of websites that have his notes for free. And this is his note on verse 4. I'll read the last paragraph. And there, John Wesley argues for dual millennialism, and he says, 1,000 years. It must be observed that two distinct 1,000 years are mentioned throughout this whole passage. Each is mentioned thrice. Thrice is an Old English word for three. He says, the 1,000 wherein Satan is bound, the 1,000 wherein the saints shall reign. The former end before the end of the world, the latter reached to the general resurrection, so that the beginning and end of the former 1,000 is before the beginning and end of the latter. Therefore, as in the second verse, at the first mention of the former, so in the fourth verse, at the first mention of the latter, it is only said 1,000 years, in other places the 1,000. That is the 1,000 mentioned before. During the former, the promises concerning the flourishing state of the church, and then he references Revelation 10:7, shall be fulfilled. During the latter, while the saints reign with Christ in heaven, men on earth will be careless and secure. So, some of those, words, maybe a little bit hard to follow, because, use a little bit of old English in there. But it was, again, highlighting the distinct periods of time, and how each period of time starts out without a definite article, and then mentions the second time it mentions the millennial period, it uses the definite article to show that respected time frame. And then the benefit would be that John Wesley could say, I could affirm both the flourishing state of the church and the pessimism, if that's the word that you want to use. I know it's very popular nowadays, pessimism, referring to the last days. I don't actually think it's pessimism. That's how God says the end is going to go down. But just to better understand the views, John Wesley would say, I could affirm both optimism and pessimism. He wouldn't use those words. I'm just using those words that are more contemporary to understand John Wesley's eschatology. And actually, he says even in verse 5, while I was still here, he says at the end, the second last sentence, he goes, there is room enough for the fulfilling of all the prophecies, and those which before seemed to clash are reconciled. So John Wesley says this is reconciling both verses. How do we reconcile verses that speak of the flourishing of the church versus the apostasy of the church? How do we reconcile those? He goes, particularly those who speak on the one hand of a most flourishing state of the church as yet to come, and on the other hand of the fatal security of men in the last days of the world. Well, John Wesley would say I'm a dual millennialist. That's how I reconcile those two. And we don't have to hold a tension between those, but we can affirm both because there's two millennial periods. So that's John Wesley's eschatology, in a nutshell. Further thoughts would have us investigating how John Wesley combined his soteriology with eschatology. So he believed that through the salvation of men, the gospel is expanding, and the kingdom of God is being advanced throughout the world. So soteriology is connected to his eschatology, and even in terms of entire sanctification. That plays into a little bit. The sanctification that many teach is at the end of the world is actually going to be before the world, because it's going to be here and now. So there's a realized eschatology aspect to it. Those are more deeper primary issues. But in particular, when it comes to the millennial period, John Wesley was not a postmillennialist or a premillennialist, not even an amillennialist. Rather, he was a dual millennialist. And I think that's important to know, because if we're going to argue that he was a premill or postmill, that's really just going to show that we need to do a little bit more study. And now, after learning his view, when I see posts like that, I cringe. I actually even saw another post on Facebook putting various premills in a Facebook cover photo, and Johann Bengal was even on there as a premillennialist. And I was once again shaking my head a little bit, because I know that's actually not the case. So hopefully we can see John Wesley's and understand the question, was he a premillennialist or postmillennialist? And we can say no, he was a dual millennialist. And I'm actually, as I studied this, I was actually surprised myself that I never heard this view before, and I haven't heard it by much Wesleyan scholars. And I'm also, even more surprised that there aren't contemporary men arguing, this view. Surprised, I haven't heard of at least one. To my knowledge, I haven't had, the or haven't found any books arguing for dual millennialism. I found some books that would explain John Wesley's dual millennialism, but I haven't found any contemporary scholars or more recent scholars arguing for this view. So I was a little bit surprised at that. But whether that's that means something or not, it's neither here nor there. But if you like this video, if you can please subscribe to Method Ministries, share it. If you're listening via podcast, I encourage you to do the same. And again, we're trying to teach more Wesleyan doctrines lately and understand Wesley's theology lately. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, comment. I do my best to answer. And until next time, we're signing off, and God bless you all.